The Negro Boys Industrial School, or NBIS, was established in 1927 in Arkansas. It was created during a time of intense racial segregation and discrimination. It was the Jim Crow era, a time when segregation was the law of the land. African Americans were systematically oppressed and denied basic rights. The NBIS was meant to house African American boys, who were often labeled as orphans, homeless, or delinquent. These labels were often unfairly applied, reflecting the prejudices of the time. In the mid-1930s, the school moved to Wrightsville and became a work farm. This move marked a significant shift in the institution's focus and operations. Manual labor was emphasized over education, unlike the experience of white boys in similar institutions, who received vocational training and a real education. This disparity highlighted the systemic racism of the era. The NBIS was a place of hardship, reflecting the brutal realities of racial injustice. The boys endured grueling conditions and were often treated harshly. The boys at NBIS often ended up there for minor offenses or because their families were torn apart by poverty. Many were victims of a system that criminalized their very existence. They were denied basic necessities, lacked adequate clothing, and suffered from poor hygiene. These conditions were a stark contrast to the care provided to white children in similar institutions. The water was undrinkable, and punishments were harsh, with whippings being common. These brutal practices were part of the daily reality for the boys at NBIS. The NBIS was a place of despair, mirroring the systemic racism that permeated society. The institution was a microcosm of the broader injustices faced by African Americans. The conditions were deplorable, and reports documented these horrors, yet little was done to improve the situation. The neglect was a testament to the indifference of the authorities. The state of Arkansas turned a blind eye to the plight of these boys, seeing them as a problem to be contained, not children to be nurtured. This lack of empathy and action was a reflection of the broader societal attitudes of the time. The NBIS was a stark reminder of the dehumanizing effects of segregation. It stood as a symbol of the systemic racism and injustice that African Americans had to endure. March 5, 1959, started like any other day at the NBIS, but the night brought unimaginable horror. A fire erupted in the dormitory, and flames engulfed the building. The boys were trapped as the dormitory doors were locked from the outside. Panic seized them, and they screamed for help, but their cries went unanswered. 48 boys managed to escape by crawling through windows, risking their lives to survive. But for 21 others, there was no escape. They perished in the inferno. The fire burned through the night, consuming everything in its path. When it was finally extinguished, only ashes and charred remains were left. The dormitory was a death trap, built in 1936 by the Works Progress Administration. The building was made of wood, poorly maintained, with no fire sprinklers, fire escapes, or fire alarms. The boys never stood a chance. The fire was a tragedy waiting to happen. The boys who died in the fire were more than just statistics. They were sons, brothers, and friends. They had hopes and dreams. They yearned for a better future, but their lives were cut short, their potential extinguished. They were victims of a system that devalued their lives. One boy was sent to NBIS for shoplifting. He was just a child. Another boy was there because his family couldn't afford to care for him, denied even the most basic necessities. These were not hardened criminals. They were children failed by the system. The fire ripped through families and communities, leaving behind a trail of grief and despair. Parents were left to bury their children, siblings were left without their playmates. The pain was immeasurable, the loss irreplaceable. The fire was a stark reminder of the human cost of racial injustice. Section 4. A State's Hollow Response, the Aftermath of Tragedy. The fire at the NBIS sent shockwaves through Arkansas. People demanded answers, seeking clarity and justice for the lives lost. They wanted to know how such a tragedy could occur, questioning the safety measures and oversight in place. Governor Orville Faubus promised a thorough investigation, assuring the public that no stone would be left unturned. He vowed to hold those responsible accountable, emphasizing the need for justice and reform. He pledged to rebuild the dormitory, promising a safer and more secure environment for the future. But his words rang hollow, as many doubted his sincerity and commitment to real change. A state board was appointed to investigate the fire, tasked with uncovering the truth behind the disaster. The board was handpicked by Faubus. Their findings were predictable, lacking the impartiality needed for true justice. They concluded that the fire was an unavoidable accident, a conclusion that many found unsatisfactory. They blamed the dormitory's condition, citing it as the primary cause of the tragedy. But they ignored the systemic neglect that led to the tragedy, a neglect that had been festering for years. Governor Faubus had slashed the NBIS budget, prioritizing other expenditures over the safety of the institution. He had ignored reports of unsafe conditions, reports that had warned of potential disasters. He had turned a blind eye to the plight of the boys, neglecting their safety and well-being. But he refused to accept any responsibility, deflecting blame and avoiding accountability. The state's response was a masterclass in damage control, a calculated effort to manage public perception. It was a cynical attempt to protect the status quo, to maintain the existing power structures. The fire exposed the rot at the heart of the system, revealing deep-seated issues that had long been ignored. Section 5. Separate and Unequal. The reality of reform schools in the Jim Crow South. The NBIS fire was a tragedy of epic proportions, a devastating event that shook the community to its core. But it was not an isolated incident. Fires and other disasters were common in segregated schools. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, a systemic neglect rooted in racial discrimination. Jim Crow segregation had a stranglehold on the South, affecting every aspect of life. It touched every aspect of life, from public facilities to education. It was particularly insidious in its impact on education, where Black children suffered the most. Black schools were chronically underfunded. They lacked basic resources, such as books and supplies. They were staffed by underqualified teachers, who were often overworked and underpaid. White schools, on the other hand, were well-funded and well-equipped, providing a stark contrast. They offered a quality education that was denied to Black children, perpetuating inequality. Reform schools were no different, reflecting the same racial disparities. White reform schools focused on rehabilitation, aiming to reintegrate children into society. They provided counseling, education, and vocational training, essential tools for a better future. Black reform schools like NBIS were more like prisons, focusing on control and punishment. They emphasized punishment over rehabilitation, often using harsh and inhumane methods. They prepared Black boys for a life of servitude, reinforcing a cycle of oppression. The fire at NBIS exposed the brutal reality of this two-tiered system, highlighting the urgent need for change. Section 6. Remembering the Lost Boys, the Importance of Memorialization. Decades have passed since the fire at NBIS, but the memory of that tragic night still haunts us. It's a reminder of the human cost of racial injustice. It's a call to action. We must never forget the 21 boys who lost their lives. We must honor their memory by fighting for justice. In recent years, there has been a renewed interest in the NBIS fire. Documentaries have been made, books have been written, memorials have been erected. These efforts are crucial. They keep the memory of the tragedy alive. They ensure that the boys are not forgotten. We must continue to tell their stories. We must educate future generations about the horrors of Jim Crow. We must never forget the lessons of the past. Only then can we hope to create a more just and equitable future. Section 7. Echoes of the Past. The NBIS fire and the fight for racial justice today. The NBIS fire may seem like a distant memory, but its echoes can still be felt today. Systemic racism continues to plague our society. It manifests itself in different ways, but its impact is no less devastating. Mass incarceration disproportionately affects Black and brown communities. Police brutality continues to claim Black lives. Educational inequities persist. The fight for racial justice is far from over. We must continue to dismantle the systems of oppression that led to the NBIS fire. We must demand accountability from our elected officials. We must push for police reform. We must invest in marginalized communities. We must never stop fighting for a more just and equitable society. The memory of the NBIS fire demands nothing less.